If sewing a straight seam is considered the first step in the learning process, then sewing a curved seam is definitely considered the second. The difficulty level increases a little bit, and you should have a pretty good grasp on your sewing machine, as you'll require a little bit more control and comfort level. There are two main challenges here. Sewing curved seam edges when the edges are opposite facing curves, or sewing a curve to a straight edge, and machine stitching these curved seams in a smooth, even manner. As always, the most important factor here is practice, practice, and more practice. But there are some techniques you can use to ease the process if you have a little bit less practice hours. Take a look. As opposed to straight seams, curved seams are a bit more difficult to sew. Stitching a curved seam requires the fabric layers to be smoothly shifted during the process in order to achieve a smooth curved stitch positioned at exactly the same distance from the edge throughout. In the sewing process, you will come across both inward and outward curves. Naturally, the more pronounced the curved seams are, the more difficult it will be to machine stitch them. In dressmaking, you will often stumble upon two slightly complicated curved seams. One requires opposite curves to be stitched together, the second entails sewing a curved edge to a straight edge. For best results, sewing a curved edge to a straight edge requires a couple of preliminary steps. If you attempt to align and pin the two edges together as is, you will find that regardless of whether the curve faces inward or outward, it can be quite frustrating to match it to a straight edge. Here's what you should do. Stay stitch the curved edge next to the seam line, but within the seam allowance. Clip evenly distributed triangular wedges into the curved seam allowance, stopping at the stay stitch line. Don't cut through the actual stitching. The number of wedge cuts needed depends on how curved the fabric edge is. The sharper the outer curve, the more densely positioned the clips should be. However, do not add too many cuts on fabrics that are loosely woven or highly fraying. Now you can match the straight edge to the curved edge with the face-side stitching. Match all existing notches in the process and insert pins perpendicular to the edge. As you align and pin the seam, the clipped wedges will allow the outward curve to extend and easily mold to the shape of the straight edge. The removal of the extra seam allowance not only adds flexibility to the curved edge, it also eliminates bulk and draws in the cut edges together for a smooth, flat finish in the final seam. Hand baste the seam edges next to the seam line and machine stitch at the designated seam allowance. Sewing opposite curves to each other requires both edges to be notched to encourage the final seam to lay flat. The outward-facing curve will be notched prior to aligning and pinning the seam. The inward curve will be clipped for tension release after the seam has been stitched. Stay stitch the outward curve edge at a small distance from the seam line. Clip wedge cuts from the edge to the stay stitching, making sure not to cut through the actual stitch line. These wedge notches will provide flexibility and eliminate bulk by pulling in the cuts together when the edge is extended. Lay the notched outward curve on top of the untreated inward curve with face sides touching and pin the seam together, matching all existing notches and marks. Insert pins perpendicular to the edge to keep the fabric layers aligned. Hand baste them for extra stability during the machine stitching process. Carefully stitch the curved edges at the designated seam allowance. To allow the seam to lay flat and eliminate strain and tension, add evenly distributed slits into the seam allowance of the inward curved edge. Doing so will cause the slits to separate into wedge-like shapes, providing flexibility, movement, and flatness in the finished seam.